Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for tuning in to this afternoon's One Georgia Town Hall with Democratic U.S. Senate nominee Jon Ossoff, who I believe will be our next senator come this November. My name is Sam Park and I'm the state representative for House District 101 located in Gwinnett County. I also have the distinction of being the first openly gay man and the first Asian American Democrat ever elected to our state legislature. Now, if you have a question and you're joining on Facebook Live, go ahead and comment below. We're going to do our best to get to as many questions as we possibly can. But given the limitation of time we have, let's go ahead and jump right in. So Senator Ossoff, and I guess I should call you Senator come this November. I'll have to wait a few more months. But first question is from Mal from Chamblee, who is wondering, if elected, what will you do to ensure a smart, coordinated national response to the coronavirus crisis?
Thank you so much, Mal. I hope you're well in Chamblee, and thanks for the question, and thanks to everyone who's tuned in. And as Representative Park mentioned, and Representative, thank you so much for doing this. If you have a question, just drop it in the comments or replies, and we'll try to get to it. So Mal's question is, if elected, what will we do to ensure a smart, coordinated national response to the coronavirus crisis? Let's start with the basics. Politicians need to recognize the limitations of their own knowledge, recognize the value of scientific expertise, and implement policies recommended by medical experts when we're in a public health emergency. We are seeing the devastating consequences of political leadership that focuses on short-term spin, that denies reality, that marginalizes the scientific and medical expertise available to it when that expertise is more vital than ever. What do we see in January, February, March as public health and global health authorities were raising the alarm? We saw the president dismissing and denying it. He didn't want to deal with it. He didn't want to deal with the ramifications of it. He didn't want to believe it. He didn't want to accept that there was a crisis that he was called upon as president of the United States to address. And we saw so many of his enablers in Congress, like Senator David Perdue, fall right into lockstep. Just blind partisanship, blind personal loyalty to Donald Trump. My opponent, Senator Perdue, was repeating almost verbatim the president's denials, saying that the risk to public health was low, saying that the impact on economic growth would be little. And now 160,000 Americans are dead, and 3 million Georgians have filed jobless claims in the last several months. We need political leadership that understands and listens to science. And until policymakers are willing to put their egos and their short-term political interests aside and implement the recommendations of public health experts, we're not going to be able to contain this virus.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jon. Shamika from Conyers is wondering, what plan do you have to help with rebuilding Georgia and our economy?
Well, let's look at this, Shamika, and thank you. And hello to everyone in Conyers. Let's look at this in two stages: short-term economic relief and long-term recovery and rebuilding. In the short term, what are we seeing right now? We're seeing members of Congress, and in particular, Senate Republicans, absolutely deadlocked in negotiations. They're sitting in plush, fancy offices, having fancy meals, talking at each other about what their political demands are, while the CARES Act unemployment insurance expired on Friday. They have known for months that this crisis would be dragging on, that people would require relief this fall, that the economy would still be in terrible shape now, that state and local governments who have seen tax revenues plummet need support, that schools would need help reopening, that families were going to face eviction and foreclosure and small businesses would need more relief. But they waited until the very last minute in order to hold the economic survival of American families hostage as a negotiating tactic. And now those unemployment insurance benefits have expired, and they're still just sitting in fancy offices negotiating and talking amongst themselves. It didn't have to be this way. That's the story of so much of this. It didn't have to be this way. And Mitch McConnell and everyone in Congress, in fact, the House passed the HEROES Act months and months ago, and it just sat wasting away in the Senate. It's not a mystery what we need to do. We need to, first of all, send direct relief to Americans. It's efficient and people need help. And my opponent, David Perdue, said he opposed and that he and his colleagues fought against that single $1,200 stimulus check the first time, while he had no problem with the hundreds of billions of dollars for corporate America and for folks like his donors. He fought against that single $1,200 stimulus check. If I were in the United States Senate right now, I'd be fighting to send more direct help to Americans. I'd be fighting to continue the PPP program so that small businesses can survive. I'd be arguing forcefully that the federal government, with its vast resources, needs to step in so that state governments and local governments don't have to cut vital services and lay off essential public sector employees during this time. I actually would take a moment and would love to hear from you, Sam, because Sam, as for those of you who aren't familiar, is a state representative here in Georgia, representing Gwinnett County. What is the fiscal picture for the state of Georgia right now?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. I mean, first and foremost, I think we need leadership that understands that in order to address the economic crisis, we have to address the healthcare crisis. And of course, as you referenced leaders like Trump and other Republican lackeys, we have a governor in the state of Georgia who has prohibited the mandating of masks, despite the fact that we know that that will help save lives, allow us to contain and control this virus, and then give us an opportunity to rebuild our economy. When it comes to the fiscal needs in the state of Georgia, we passed our budget a few months ago, I should say, and we had to Republicans cut up to $1 billion in K through 12 public education and nearly $250 million to higher education. Those types of cuts are going to continue unless we receive additional fiscal aid for the short run. But again, I think it's important for all of us to understand that without new leadership that actually addresses this healthcare crisis that we're in, the economic situation is going to get potentially worse. And the longer this drags on, the harder it's going to be for all of us. And so again, I think the urgency in which we need to elect folks like Jon and others who will listen to the science is so critically important for not just our individual welfare, but I think for the safety and well-being of our nation as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, just, in terms of the federal government's priorities right now, between Congress and the Federal Reserve Bank, literally trillions of dollars of grants and interest-free or low-interest loans have been pumped into the banking system, have been pumped into the corporate sector. And states like Georgia and counties like Gwinnett County and cities like Conyers, Shamika, are desperately short of resources to provide vital services to the public. So the short-term economic package needs to include support for state and local governments. It needs to include a full extension of the CARES Act unemployment insurance. People are out of work right now for no fault of their own. One of the things that I think is so disturbing about Senator Perdue's worldview is that he believes people are just sitting at home collecting unemployment checks right now as a choice. He doesn't seem to recognize, and this is something he says out in the open, he says that the unemployment insurance creates an incentive for people to stay out of a job market. People are not unemployed right now by choice, Senator Perdue. They're unemployed because we're in the midst of a grave public health and economic crisis, which you and the president denied for months. You had enough time to trade medical stocks and sell your casino shares while you were assuring the rest of us everything would be fine. These 3 million Americans who have filed jobless claims need your help, Senator Perdue, because the economy is in a terrible, terrible position. And all of this damage has been compounded by the ineptitude, the catastrophic incompetence of people in Washington. And Shamika, just to answer your question about the long run, we're going to need a major infrastructure package early next year with investments in job training, transit, transportation, clean energy, rural broadband, health clinics, laying the foundations for prosperity and creating good jobs for folks who are still going to be struggling economically from the consequences of this pandemic. Thank you for the question, Shamika.
The one thing I would add before going on to our next question is just we need to have bottom-up growth. And as you mentioned, John, we need to invest in people, in their healthcare and education, rather than continuing to give tax cuts to the wealthy and expect it to trickle down. We need leaders who will actually put people first, not by what they say, but their actions. And so thank you for all you plan on doing. So Al from Jekyll Island asks, as a retired teacher, I want to know about your position on public education. What are your plans, priorities for K through 12 education, and to help college graduates with student loans?
Thank you so much, Al, and I hope that all is well on Jekyll. It's a beautiful place. Thank you for the question. So let's talk first about higher education, and then we'll talk about primary and secondary education. First thing I want to say is, in the political discussion, especially at the national level, we talk a lot about four-year college degrees, as we should, because for many, many people, that degree is the bridge to the career of their choice, to achieving their dreams, to the enlightenment and enrichment that they seek. And my commitment is that I will fight to ensure that attending a public college or university in this country is 100% debt-free for every American. You should not have to take on debt to go and get a college degree from one of our great public colleges or universities. But while we talk about the importance of making college affordable, I think sometimes we neglect the importance of vocational training, technical training, and job training. Because for Georgians who may right now be working in the gig economy or making $11, $15, $20 an hour in the service sector, something like an HVAC certificate, a welding certificate, a commercial driving license can be transformative, can move your pay to $40 or $50 an hour with benefits, can allow you to build wealth for your family, build savings for your kids' education, and really sustain and grow wealth. And that's what families need, not to be living paycheck to paycheck, not to always be a few $100s or an unexpected healthcare cost or an unexpected crisis or a pandemic away from eviction or foreclosure, but to have that economic security. That's the American dream. So my commitment is also that I will fight to make vocational training, technical school, job training 100% free, period, for all Americans. And indeed, I think in many cases, those programs should be paid. Looking at K through 12 education, first of all, and Education Secretary Betsy DeVos isn't going to like this, federal tax dollars should not be going to for-profit K through 12 education. It absolutely should not. We should be putting our public schools first, not for-profit K through 12 education. Second of all, we really need to look at how we can expand early childhood learning, pre-kindergarten, and daycare opportunities for working families in Georgia and across the country. Getting their kids access to high quality education in early childhood is transformative for laying the foundations for that child's education. And the burden of daily childcare for working moms and working families across the country is massive. So that's somewhere where I'd like to see targeted federal investment to expand pre-K and early childhood education for Georgia families and families across the country. And I will always put our public schools first. Thank you so much, Al. And I hope that the storm didn't cause you too much trouble on Jekyll Island.
Great. Alice from Lawrenceville asks, what are your top 3 issues that sets you apart from David Perdue?
Well, let's start with healthcare. Senator David Perdue, right now, in the midst of a pandemic, is backing a lawsuit to repeal the Affordable Care Act, which would then allow insurance companies to discriminate, deny coverage, price gouge for people with pre-existing conditions in the middle of a pandemic, when those pre-existing conditions like asthma, diabetes, hypertension make people more vulnerable to COVID-19. David Perdue is carrying water for the insurance industry because they heavily bankroll his campaign. Just like Senator Perdue voted against cracking down on price gouging by pharmaceutical companies. Georgians are being forced to pay outrageous prices for healthcare. The drug and insurance industries are ripping us off every day. And it's not because that's the natural state of the world. It's because politicians like David Perdue let them get away with it. Second of all, let's return to economic policy. And some of this we covered in an earlier answer. But again, Senator Perdue wants to cut unemployment insurance in the middle of a joblessness crisis that's the fault of no one except those politicians who denied that this was a real problem and let it fester and then rage uncontrollably across the country. He wants to cut unemployment insurance benefits. He said he personally opposed and that most of his colleagues on his side of the aisle fought against a single $1,200 stimulus check for working Americans. But he doesn't raise any objection. There's not a peep when huge sums of money are flowing to the corporate sector. Now, look, the health of America's large enterprises and large businesses is relevant. We want American businesses of all sizes to survive this crisis and to thrive afterwards. But the way that David Perdue prioritizes the largest corporations and trade groups and then asks ordinary people to fend for themselves, the way, as you mentioned earlier, Sam, the way he's so focused on trying to promote economic growth only from the very top, without concern for the daily needs of people who are on the brink of financial ruin, for whom that $1,200 check is the difference between eviction and homelessness or staying in the house, I think is shocking. So, I support that bottom-up approach that Representative Sam Park was talking about. We need to invest in regular, hardworking American families and not just hope that huge subsidies for Wall Street banks and corporate America trickle down in a crisis like this. Third of all, look at the way Senator Perdue raises money. And this will explain a lot of his positions on policy. This is a guy who literally sends ornate menus to corporate lobbyists that promise certain levels of access for different levels of campaign contributions. He'll tell these lobbyists in writing, if you make a $7,500 corporate PAC contribution to his campaign, then you're entitled to 4 meetings a year. You're entitled to a luxurious, exclusive retreat on the private island where he lives. You're entitled to access to the senator's home for campaign cash from trade groups and corporations. And as long as that's how politicians are funding their campaigns, it's no wonder that they serve those narrow private interests and not the public interest. I will go to the Senate to overturn the Citizens United decision to ban dark money from American politics, to reduce individual giving limits and reduce the influence of corporate PACs. David Perdue has no ambition, no vision to reform our campaign finance system because it's how he runs his political machine.
Can I say one thing on healthcare?
Please.
I saw an ad from David Perdue on healthcare saying he's going to do all this wonderful things, right? 6 years. He's been in office for 6 years. What has he done? Absolutely nothing. I would encourage everyone, don't just listen to what politicians say. Look at what they do and vote accordingly.
Yeah, suddenly, right, Sam, it's re-election time, and suddenly David Perdue has a plan to lower drug prices. Mm-hmm.
Right. Nonsense. So from Facebook Live, Angelica wants to know, do you support collective bargaining rights for public sector workers?
Yes, I do. And one of the reasons that we've seen the American middle class shrink and we've seen wages remain stagnant for decades while the economy has grown and corporate profitability has grown has been because of an unrelenting assault on workers and the labor movement here in the United States. And those collective bargaining rights, whether in the private sector or in the public sector, are what allow workers to match the power of their corporate employers or their government employers. And until we restore those collective bargaining rights for American workers, they're not going to have the power necessary to demand fair wages, benefits, the vacation policies that they deserve, the paid family leave and sick leave policies that they deserve, the opportunity for promotion, the opportunity to ensure that they're not fired without just cause. So I have to again draw contrast with my opponent. Senator Perdue, when he was in the corporate sector, these are his own words. He spent most of his career outsourcing. Those are David Perdue's own words. Spent most of his career outsourcing. Not only that, he brags that he's proud of it. He made his fortune exploiting bad trade deals to ship American productive capacity and jobs overseas to increase profit margins for shareholders on Wall Street. That was his job. His job was to send American jobs overseas. And the impact of those practices in the corporate sector intersecting with this assault on organized labor is one of the reasons that we've seen such a terrible toll taken on working families across the country and the American middle class.
So we have another question from Facebook Live. Rebecca Sandberg from Roswell wants to know, will there be any kind of awareness campaign to ensure voters know how to get an absentee ballot to vote by mail in November?
Yes. And hey, Rebecca, hope you're well. Love to the family. Hope you're staying healthy. So we will be ramping up communications on digital platforms, not just organic social media, but also targeted advertising, as well as in the mail, to ensure that every eligible voter has all the information they need to cast their ballot, to ensure that their ballot is properly counted, and to get that done early. We don't want to wait until the very last minute for any of this. We want people to be able to apply for, fill out, send in their absentee ballots with enough time to adjust plans in the event they don't receive them as they should, which we saw happen in far too many cases, including my own during the primary, to make a plan to vote early. We will be texting and calling literally millions of households across the state to ensure they know the early voting place, the vote by mail procedures, all the relevant deadlines. It's probably going to get a little bit annoying, the level of contact from the campaign, reminding folks to vote and informing them how to. But I will need everyone's help to do that. So this is a good opportunity to plug volunteer opportunities. If you want to help out in that effort from the safety of home, we're not going to put public health at risk. You can call and text and email your fellow Georgians and help empower people to vote and help protect voting rights here in Georgia. It's electjon.com, electjon.com/volunteer.
Use the power y'all have and go vote for John, y'all. So Mary from Helen is wondering, when you were in the Senate, how would you go about getting rid of private prisons?
Hey, Mary, and hello to everyone in Helen, and thank you for tuning in, Mary. Quite simply, I will work in the US Senate and support legislation and introduce legislation to ban private prisons in the United States, period. It is wrong to make money incarcerating human beings, and there shouldn't be for-profit and private prisons in this country, and I'll work to end that practice. And I appreciate the question.
Yeah, on that note, I know the state of Georgia spends $150 million a year on private prisons. And again, this is in the midst of all of these cuts to education that we're continuing to see. Hansel from Atlanta wants to know, from Facebook Live, wants to know, what are the major areas you think the U.S. should focus on regarding our relationship with Russia and China? It's a great question.
Hey, Hansel, that is a great question. And I could go on for a long time about this, but I'll keep it concise and to the point, and I'll just talk about top priorities in both relationships. So when it comes to U.S.-Russia relations, we have to be focused on repairing the nuclear non-proliferation and arms control treaty regime that restricts the production and testing of nuclear weapons and delivery systems for nuclear warheads. I know that sounds kind of nerdy and technical, but this is vital to world peace. We need, and Sam, our generation in positions of leadership need to recognize that continuing to allow the threat of nuclear Armageddon to hang over the heads of every human being on this planet is grossly irresponsible. It's obscene. We shouldn't, humanity should not be subjected to that kind of threat. And right now, what's happening is both Russia and the United States are backing away from treaty commitments, in some cases entered into decades ago, that helps reduce the threat of nuclear war. So when it comes to US-Russia relations, I think that needs to be a top priority. I also think that we need an administration that will be straight with the American people when the Russian government or any government is interfering in US elections, is paying off, for example, the Taliban to attack US forces. I think a lot of people feel tremendous discomfort and suspicion when Trump is so evasive when it comes to criticizing the Russian government, especially when they're attacking Americans. So when it comes to China, obviously it's a very complex relationship. It is true that we need to renegotiate the terms of trade with China, that American workers and American businesses have been getting exploited by China, the theft of intellectual property, the use of exploitive virtual slave labor, and in many cases, actual slave labor in China, and American businesses that have patronized those kinds of production facilities. We have to renegotiate the terms of trade with China. We also need to ensure that at the political and the military level, we're not on the path to military confrontation with China. So we need to renegotiate the economic relationship while also building the diplomatic foundation. And that means largely strengthening our relationships with all of our allies in that region and having very clear communication with the Chinese government to head off what could become something like a Cold War military competition with the Chinese. Thank you for the question.
The one thing I would add to that is I think we also need a real leader of the free world who will demonstrate what democracy really is about, especially as we see authoritarianism continue to rise throughout the world.
I think that's a great point, Sam. And when you look at what China is doing to the Uyghur people, and the use of concentration camps, the repression of democratic activism in Hong Kong, the Russian government's constant attacks on political dissidents. Just as an aside, because you mentioned it, and as you should have, Sam, as you know, in the private sector, my day job is to run a small business that produces investigations of corruption and organized crime for international news organizations. And we have seen the threats to the journalists that we work with increase massively just in the last 3 or 4 years. And in fact, we lost a colleague who was assassinated in January of last year. And when the US government and the US president no longer set the standard for human rights, press freedom, democratic principles in the world, no one else is going to carry that torch. And we've seen how emboldened foreign autocrats and others who would attack journalists are, because now the US president simply insults and attacks the press and calls them the enemy of the people. That emboldens attacks on the free press everywhere, including here in the United States, where we've seen a shocking level of violence against reporters and producers covering some of the recent protests.
So our last question is going to be from Julie from Twitter, who asks, how do you feel about the influence the NRA has on politics?
I think that the NRA distorts policy so that it doesn't serve public health or public safety. It's not consistent with what the overwhelming majority of Americans, the majority of gun owners, the majority of Georgians recognize as common sense, that we need universal background checks, that we need to restrict the availability of semi-automatic rifles and high-capacity magazines and suppressors, that weapons of war don't belong on our streets. And my message to gun owners and enthusiasts in Georgia is, I respect you, and I respect and will defend your Second Amendment rights. And the NRA doesn't represent your interests. The NRA represents the interests of the weapons manufacturing industry. The NRA's sole objective is to create a legislative and policy environment where absolutely as many weapons as possible of all kinds can be sold as fast as possible, because that increases profits for weapons manufacturers. But in so doing, they're actually putting so many people at risk by flooding our streets with these weapons. You know, gun ownership is something that is serious, that requires great responsibility and care and diligence and qualification. And guns are lethal tools. They're not toys. And I think that the NRA has a really, really negative impact on gun policy. And I look forward to going to the US Senate to fight alongside, for example, Congresswoman Lucy McBath, a champion for reform, to, yes, protect American Second Amendment rights and keep Americans safe, especially American children in our schools. We shouldn't have to worry that, you know, anyone could walk in with an AR-15 and open fire.
Fantastic. Well, I think we're wrapping up as we're closing things out and running out of time. But Jon, I wanted to personally thank you for stepping up and running, as well as demonstrating the kind of leadership that we need today. One that takes the time to answer questions of the people that you seek to serve, as well as someone who is trying to heal the deep wounds in our nation and unify us behind a common purpose and our shared American values. I look forward to doing everything I can to ensure you have an opportunity to serve as our next U.S. Senator. Please give your lovely wife, Alicia, and your mom, Heather, my love. So thanks so much.
I will. And Representative, I'm so proud of you and all that you've accomplished and will continue to accomplish for the people of our state. I'm grateful for your friendship and for your support. And I'm excited, really excited, even in these bleak times, about what we're going to be able to achieve together for this state moving forward, because change is coming, everybody. Change for the better is coming. We are going to open a new chapter in American history. We're going to bring this country together again. We're going to heal the terrible wounds that have been so cynically opened, try to exploit division for political gain. No more of that. It's time to come together as Americans and Georgians and enact an agenda that serves all of us. And it's right around the corner. So much love, Sam. Much love, everybody. Stay healthy.